By 2030, the aim is to ensure no one will live in extreme poverty anywhere in the world. Poverty does not occur in isolation. It is a complex issue that is intertwined with other societal issues such as health challenges, mental illness, education, and housing. This panel brings together all sectors of society to address ways to alleviate poverty, from those creating ways of funding NGO poverty alleviation strategies, Australian experts in social policy, and those working on the front line with people in crisis. So I'd like to invite our panel, Amanda Davis, COO, Brian Holden Vision. Please come out and join me on the couch. Adam Mooney, CEO, Good Shepherd Microfinance. Les Hems, Director Advisory at Ernst Young. Susan Goodwin, Associate Professor, Policy Studies, University of Sydney. And Prashan Paramanathan, CEO of Chuffed. Please welcome our panel. Thank you. So I guess I just want to ask a broad question, and Adam, I might start with you. What do you see as the biggest challenge to solving, alleviate or solving poverty?
I think one of the biggest challenges to alleviating poverty is about moving away from governments, investors wanting to see irrefutable evidence that will guarantee something will work. I think that for poverty alleviation, or we don't want to alleviate poverty, we want to eradicate it, but what we want to do, that's the negative. What we want to do is to realise the hope that all 7 billion of us can define our own well-being as individuals and as families, and then use our own strengths to realise that well-being. And I know that's a sort of a very broad aim, but one of the things that I think that we really need to focus on is what happens when hope is enabled. The amygdala brainwaves that happen when somebody looks you in the eye and says, I believe you, I think that your vision of your future, of being in control, being optimistic, and being able to be an actor in your own development, that when somebody believes in you and your vision, that you become so much more in control of your life. And I think that things that give hope are the most important aspects. For us, microfinance is one of those things. For me, 10 years ago, sitting underneath a tree, you asked Chris earlier about his sort of moment. I actually did have one myself, sitting under a tree in a village in Cambodia where working with a microfinance worker and a client, where the worker said, your view or your aim to start a fishing cooperative, this is a group of women, to start a fishing cooperative, to buy the boat that they were renting, to buy bikes to be able to get the fish to market, to take a longer route to avoid the unofficial fees that the police and others were taking along the way, saw that business being very, very successful. For me personally, the next day I just happened to see a woman who was working in Cambodia in a rural community as a beer girl. For those of you that don't know, these are waiters that wear Heineken or Tiger as a brand and deliver beer to people in the restaurant. I saw her arguing. They also moonlight as sex workers because of the very low income that they get paid. I saw her having an argument with a client that unfortunately ended up with this poor woman being beaten to death. Reading about her story in the newspaper the next day made me realise that, the facts emerged that her uncle took her from one community to another place, internal human trafficking within Cambodia, that she was seen as an economic instrument to be applied to make money for the family, and that seeing the contrasting dignity, opportunity and hope of the women the day before, and the situation that this poor young woman was in, only 16, 17, a young girl, being forced into this very hazardous profession, made me realise that when there is hope present, things happen. So that would be my one simple explanation to, and I wouldn't call it alleviating poverty, I would call this about realising dreams and aspirations.
Prashan, I'm interested to hear about your view on this in relation to what you do with Chuffed. Can you just comment on that?
Yeah, so Actually, I'll tell it from a slightly different perspective rather than the Chuff's perspective. So I think the really important thing to change is moving from a model of this is kind of a top-down responsibility for kind of someone really big to fix to, like, actually there's a whole bunch of people out there that are already with great solutions who own their own problems who are doing this. Right? And this view has really come from my kind of personal background. So when I kind of started life as a corporate management consultant, that lasted all of like 10 months or something or other. I went to China because that's where I thought all the money was. And I went for go for kind of the best way I could make big impact is go work with where all the money is. And so I ended up working with the IFC, which is the private sector arm of the World Bank. And the entire model was based off flying in really expensive European consultants to kind of consult these poor Chinese people who didn't know what they were doing on how they should kind of set up these microfinance banks. And my job was to redo all the work that these really expensive European consultants had stuffed up because they didn't listen to the Chinese people who knew how to get stuff done in China. And so what that kind of instilled in me is actually all these people who are out there who are doing great stuff. And if we can find a way of creating a more distributed model, that's going to be the thing that really changes it.
And how do you do that then?
So the way that we do that with Chuff.org, so Chuff's a crowdfunding platform for social cause projects. What we're trying to figure out is how do you take all these ideas who are out there and connect them up with donors in a fun, engaging way that's not here's a starving child, feel bad about your life and give to them. How do you create an experience for people where they actually really feel like part of that solution?
And Amanda, what's your view on that? How do you sort of tackle that?
So I work in the area of blindness prevention, and I'll just give you a sort of program example to sort of illustrate that. And I'm talking about, I guess, a systems approach for poverty alleviation. There is a direct link between uncorrected vision impairment and poverty, and also between poverty and uncorrected vision impairment. A number of years ago, we were asked to attend a blind school in Malawi to do a health check on some of the kids there. There was a young boy there, his name was Emmanuel, he was 16 years old and was about at the academic level of a grade 3 kid using Braille. Turns out he wasn't blind, he was just significantly vision impaired that could be corrected with a pair of glasses. I'm talking the thick Coke bottle variety, but a pair of glasses. Not only that, 50% of those kids were in the same boat. 50% of those kids could be corrected with a pair of glasses. So we've got 640 million people worldwide who are vision impaired just because they don't have a pair of glasses. And you're talking about 13th century technology here. Emmanuel went on and he left that school when he finished and graduated, and the last we heard, as we've used him as a bit of a case study, was that he was studying accounting. But this is not really a good news story because it just illustrates a massive failure of the health system. As soon as we walked out of there, filled up again. So It's about thinking about a systems-based approach, programming sort of strategically in a comprehensive and inclusive way to ensure that you're really making that sort of long-term sustainable impact.
And I guess, Susan, how does social policy then marry into that?
Yeah, we were speaking about this before, that is an example of the real importance of having universal social policies that have vision at their centre. I mean, even in Australia, we don't have that because it hasn't been politicised as a poverty issue in the same way as some other areas like food security, for example, have been. So there's a place for social movements in politicising issues as something to be addressed by public policy and social policy being enabled to make universal provisions through societies agreeing that they will pay for those kind of universal provisions. But it's a combination of the ground up identification and politicisation of an issue, and then the top-down universal provisions.
And I guess, Les, you're part of a very large firm, Ernst & Young. So from your perspective, what role does a large firm play, particularly when you're talking from, I guess, ground up rather than top down? How do you sort of match the two or navigate the two?
Well, I think my role is to try and play that kind of coordination role between the top-down and bottom-up. EY's strapline is actually a better working world, which is not just in terms of the profit-making, but trying to make communities and organisations function better. I think one of the big challenges, and which becomes very central to my role and the people I work with at EY, is dealing with complexity. What we've heard from the other panellists is people who are experiencing poverty usually are faced by a huge complexity of issues. And currently government funding tends to be very siloed, so it will actually kind of address one particular issue, whether it be physical or mental health or to do with kind of unemployment or an underproductivity. But everything we've heard in terms of the bottom up is you have to listen to the needs of individuals and give them the opportunities to address physical issues, which are fundamental, but also mental health issues as well. And one of the things we do is we try and use this thing we call a kind of an outcomes hierarchy. If you don't provide people with an opportunity to have appropriate and stable housing, then it is very difficult to actually address any other issues. If they have any issues to do with mental health or trauma in their lives, and I'm thinking here in terms of refugees and members of the Aboriginal community, child protection issues and so on, if you don't deal with the trauma in somebody's life, then it's going to be very, very difficult for them to progress education or employment-wise. And then similarly, if they're isolated, if they're not part of a family, kinship or community, it's very difficult for them to really fulfill their goals in life. So you need to be ensuring that people are feeling connected and so on. If you get those three things kind of established, the housing, the physical and mental health kind of issues, the connection to family, kinship group or community, then you can start building kind of life skills which then go on to achieving kind of education and employment outcomes. Sadly, what we tend to do is just to say people need to get a job. That's just not the way to go about it. So I've got a great kind of team of people I work with at EY who understand that, and they think their role is to help government do a much better job at supporting people, and then similarly helping businesses be more purpose-driven rather than profit-driven, and that helps obviously things like concepts like shared value.
What you just said there about, sadly, sometimes people just say, you need to get a job. Now, we did hear a similar comment from our former treasurer, and so I guess, in order to afford a house in Sydney, you just got to get a bit well-paying job kind of thing. Right, okay. So, and of course he's, not in that position anymore, but to what extent do you think that people in government, on both sides of government, are out of touch with what actually it takes to solve these kinds of complex policies and problems? And it's not necessarily, Les, you don't necessarily have to answer that. I'm throwing it open to the whole panel. I don't want you to panic.
Well, I'll have a go first, and obviously this is my personal opinion. I think there are some politicians that do understand, and I think there are some that don't. But I think the ones that are increasingly understanding how you have to invest in people all throughout their lives if you want to get the positive outcomes. I think there's more people now who understand the complexity and want to provide opportunities through providing kind of multiple supports and so on. There's a fantastic kind of work going on in New Zealand at the moment, which is around, and it was called an investment approach, a long-term intergenerational change approach, and especially kind of helping young children, but also families to break that kind of intergenerational kind of poverty cycle. So I think we're on the cusp of politicians actually having a much better understanding of how to help.
I just wanted to ask, but hasn't the financial services industry contributed to the dominance of this discourse, that the dominance of this idea that the economic bottom line is the most important thing?
Can I answer that as well? Someone who worked in a bank for 15 years at ANZ, I finished up with them about eight years ago, I think. There's a political aspect, and then there's a sort of the role of corporates that you could look at. This sort of psychopathic behaviour of the corporates that's been well discussed. And what's happened since the global financial crisis is that I think before the global financial crisis in 2008, this is quoting David Murray, the chair of the Financial System Inquiry last year when I met with him. He was saying that the average time that an institutional investor held a bank share was 7 years. And therefore things that had a 7-year maturity, like social programs and economic mobility of people that are excluded, were more likely to be supported. What's happened since the global financial crisis in 2008 is institutional investors are more skittish. They are demanding, they're moving around from share registries. They're putting tacit and direct pressure on the chair and the CEO to outperform their sectoral peers, but do it in a way. I've actually sat in a room in London, this was even before the financial crisis, where the large institutional investors were saying to myself, to John McFarlane and to other people that then at ANZ, we hold 13% of your stock. You don't know this, but there's 5 or 6 nominee companies. We control 13% of your stock. We want you to outperform your sectoral colleagues in the next 6 to 12 months by harvesting, moving away non-core people, and revenue enhancement, charging fees and interest that will have a low consciousness in the mind of the customer, and they'll find out about it 3 to 6 months later. This is a recognised phenomenon. That's why my question earlier to the professor was about lifting the veil on who owns these, the beneficial owners, who owns this. So I also see, not to the same degree, a challenge, a timing issue. I call it an investment maturity mismatch, because with government in particular, 3-year electoral cycles, only things that will, and by the time social programs are funded, everyone wants a new answer. They want recognition as the minister that announced this. I mean, I've been here in my role for 3 years, the CEO of Good Shepherd Microfinance. We've had 5 ministers for social services in that time. Some of them have done a very good job, but we now need to go to the next minister and say, here's the economic mobility. But I think from a hope perspective, what we do need to do is to brief both the government, the opposition, and major parties, the Greens and others, simultaneously, so that there is a consensus. There is a new hope, I think, with Malcolm Turnbull as Prime Minister, a new politicking that is actually coming in, that is not transactional, that is more visionary. And I think that we need to have that shared vision, move away from the partisan politicking, point scoring, and demand more of our politicians that they will back the programs that work. Just very quickly, the last point I want to make is that 4 out of 5 of the 170,000 people that Good Shepherd Microfinance have become economically mobile within 2 to 5 years. So it does take a bit longer for people on lower incomes, but Les's point about investing in people's capacity to be actors in their own development, and at this point in their lives, they may not be a target client of a major corporate, but in 3 to 5 years' time they will, and boy will they remember who backed them when the chips were down.
I mean, I think the other thing that's important is I'm careful about overstating the importance of government in solving these problems, right? And it's fascinating to see what happened when we had the kind of last couple of years of government, because I think what happened was there was people were like, okay, well, they're not going to help, and so we need to do it ourselves. And you got these kind of unholy coalitions in like the Reform Council. Yeah, right. That actually, I don't think if you had a government that was like super progressive, that would have happened. And I think that's kind of an interesting dynamic that happens. And so I think that actually when you kind of pull government away, it's easier to see and becomes kind of a lot clearer to the naked eye of the power and influence that the rest of us have.
Amanda, what would you say to that?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point. And I mean, there's obviously signs that things are changing again. I mean, the fact that we've now got a Minister for International Development is a good sign. I do agree and we struggle a lot with this with our programming, that the funding cycles are way too short to be able to really reach any meaningful impact from time to time. DFAT, who we work through, however, are quite consultative. They do sort of measure the impact of the programming. They are looking at sort of innovative ways to push forward, particularly looking at sort of private sector engagement and the role in that for development. So I think that's a really good point, that it's sort of created this space to see, well, what else happens? Who else's responsibility is this? And, you know, if you brought the government back in again now, that could be a nice little sweet space for us to really start making some major inroads.
Now, just before we go to another question, I'm just going to encourage, we're nearing lunchtime, so I just encourage anyone who has a question, please line up at the microphones. But one thing I wanted to ask is, does the funding from governments, somebody mentioned silos before, to what extent does this traditional sort of, I guess, format of funding from government, do they compete against each other, which basically knocks out the purpose of what they're doing? Do you know what I'm saying? So.
Yeah, and what it does, it creates competition between those organisations which are delivering services in communities, and I'm sure kind of Adam will support me on this. What we really need are organisations which are serving the interests of not just actually individuals, but families. We design silos around the services, but we've also targeted individuals. Everything tells me that a family-centred approach will yield dividends. Within a household, if you've got somebody, say, who's got type 2 diabetes, they don't want to be sitting at the table eating kind of lettuce and salad when the other people around the table are eating kind of deep-fried chicken. And you can replicate that across things like drug and alcohol. You can't put somebody through rehab and then for them to return home without the family understanding the type of support that's required. So the nature of government funding has to fundamentally change. And at the moment, we're seeing a push towards what are called individualised payments, where people with disabilities will receive payments for particular services in relation to helping them achieve their goals and aspirations. But that, to me, is potentially kind of fragmenting the nature of kind of government support. What we're seeing in Indigenous communities is concepts like empowering communities, which is giving governance to the community level, and hopefully through representative structures, and then allowing them to access pooled funding. So all the government funding which would have gone into the community then becomes available to a properly kind of representative governance group within a community. That's really kind of sophisticated and mature use of government funding and giving people the biggest opportunity. It'll be interesting to see whether, if that model is successful, whether it can be actually replicated into urban areas and be available to the wider kind of population and not just Aboriginal communities.
Your question?
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Abul. I worked with Professor Mohammad Yunus and have seen his traditional microbusiness and microfinance from frontline. So my question is to Susan and Adam. Basically, don't you think this is the time we should change traditional banana microbusiness to technological microbusiness, something like this? So banana microbusiness means you give money to someone who will buy banana and then sell in the market, buy more banana. Instead of, you should create some sort of microbusiness where you will create technological experts or kids or something, and then they will change the society in due course and alleviate poverty.
Thank you, and thank you for mentioning the great Professor Mohammad Yunus. At the same time as Professor Mohammad Yunus walked out his door at the World Bank in Dhaka, Bangladesh, the Good Shepherd Sisters in 1981 were starting microfinance in Collingwood here in Victoria. We're trying to tell that story a little bit more, but thank you for your question. I agree that technology has a huge role to play. I think that for micro enterprise development, microfinance, inclusive finance more generally, in my observation over 15 or 20 years, what I've seen works very, very well simple good business practices. You mentioned a banana vendor, simple, easily replicable enterprises and skills, whether it's ice vending, basic primary production like that, or retailing. What you'll find is in one community that will start, it will then be copied, and that vendor will be priced out of the market, or there'll be so skill building, whether it's technical skill building, other skill building around, whether it's weaving, having a higher set of skills and capabilities is a really important part of inclusive finance. But the role of technology and I think is really important for things where crowdsourcing, you can actually connect a like-minded investor in microfinance with a micro-entrepreneur. For example, we were just talking before about a retired motor mechanic in Melbourne wanting to invest and provide capital for a fledgling enterprise, motor mechanic enterprise in Broome, an Aboriginal micro-enterprise, where you have that alignment between investor and borrower, and there's a willingness to either share or certainly have a sense of meaning around the importance. I think that's where technology can play a real role, whether it's peer-to-peer connectedness or others. Yep.
Just mentioning, we had a recent bilateral discussion with Professor Mohammad Yunus, and we were trying to do something stem cell club type things in Adelaide, and he also agreed to do something in collaboration with Grameen and stuff like that. So yeah, we are working on it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And all types of arrangements, peer-based lending, individual lending, a whole range of different microfinance, and one size doesn't fit all, that we need to be community-led. We are community-led in our view, and we all are community-led, I'm sure, in this room. What is the vision of the future that the client has? What skills and strengths do we consciously need to identify within the client, and for the client to be in control? Whether they want to form a cooperative is up to them, but we need to be absolutely responsive to the client's needs.
Thank you. Now, did you have a question?
Yes.
Yeah, and that'll be our final question for the second.
Okay. So there are 4 billion people that need support to do something. How much money do you think you need to generate, and where does that money come from that you can give to people to empower 4 billion people to do something? And that gives you the power to do it. Seriously.
Yeah. It's simple, but there's not the political courage to do it. The central banks around the world are sitting on stockpiles of what's called stabilisation funds that are sitting there in a...
Point, Mike, just
sorry.
back. It's just a bit...
Yeah. There are stabilisation funds. The Reserve Bank of Australia, for example, 3 months after the election of the coalition government, received $8 billion, literally sitting in a bank vault in Martin Place, that is not being applied for the purpose for which it's intended: stabilisation of the financial system. At the moment, our financial system is unstable, because in Australia you've got 3 million people that are financially excluded, that are not able to get into the right products and services that they need to become economically mobile. We're having some reach. We've reached about 6% of the market, Good Shepherd Microfinance, but the central banks, and I'm going to draw a direct correlation between the role of the Reserve Bank and the central banks and what microfinance does, inclusive finance does. The charter of the Reserve Bank of Australia is to tend the economy to full employment. Secondly, to have an efficient and effective financial system. Efficiency is absolutely what microfinance is all about. Tending people to employment by working with them with business opportunities, or even if it's for consumption, as a foundational, if it's for a fridge or a washing machine, as a foundational investment by which people can become economically mobile and find jobs. I agree with what we've all said, that no one wakes up in the morning and says, I'm going to go out and get a job and drive economic growth or drive GDP. Maybe not even Milton Friedman says that when he gets up in the morning. But the means to an end is a full life that has meaning, that has dignity, where your dreams, to that degree, that outcome, the output is a job or some sort of wherewithal. Whether in Vanita's presentation on caring relationships was absolutely spot on, that money is a means to that end, as it is with microfinance.
Prashan, I'm just looking at you. Do you have any comment on that?
That
Or?
was really good.
Maybe you can crowdfund us.
All right. All right. Well, listen, before we break for lunch, I'm just going to go down the panel, and the big question is, and on this topic, so Prashan, by 2030 in this area, what would you like to see eradicated or alleviated? What area? What part of it? What would you like to see happening? Or anyone can go first. You don't have to go first. Anyone want to put their hand up? Susan?
I'll say gender inequality.
Yeah. Yeah. No pressure, just jump in.
You can say gender inequality.
I would like to see the dialogue shifted from poverty alleviation to hope and potential realisation. Set a measure that's objective, and we're not trying to avoid alleviating.
Okay, it's just a headline, Adam.
So that's
just
it.
a headline.
So I'm going to be.
Oh.
I'll be quite specific
Yes.
about mine. I'd like to see eye health on the health agendas of all governments, integrated into policy and financed within those policies.
Great. And Prashan?
So I think these problems get solved by people, and so I want the kind of next generation of people coming through to not have to make a choice between kind of doing good and making money. That those two things will be the same thing.
Yeah. And finally, Les?
Well, I think it's important that people right from the early stage understand their own agency and that they have potential in front of them. So I'd like to ensure that every child has that vision of potential.
Thank you. And please join me in thanking the panel.